One of the challenges we have right now is that we have DHCP assigned addresses on our ESXi host, and if we want to change that, we do have some options to do that, including using the Direct Console user interface. Now, initially, to manage these ESXi hosts, which we installed in the previous lab, we have a couple options. Because they did get IP addresses of .101 and .102 and .103 for ESXi host 1, 2, and 3 respectively, we could go ahead from a computer, open a browser, and connect over to them to that address. Or if we wanted to go directly to the console of this host that's running ESXi, we could go directly to the monitor, to the console on that system, and do some basic management using the DCUI, the Direct Console User Interface. And it's really simple to use. You go to the computer, you hit F2, it's going to ask us for the password that we configured during the installation, and the default username on each of these ESXi hosts is lowercase root. So what I'd like us to do in the lab is we'll go in, take a look at how to use the DCUI. We'll also statically configure these IP addresses on each of these hosts. And let's also disable IPv6 so it won't try to use IPv6 for communications. There's also some other things we can look at while we're there. For example, if we were connected via our network card to a switch, and we were using trunking, and we needed to tell the ESXi host, hey, you're on VLAN 20 or you're on VLAN 30. We could also, through the Direct Console User Interface, configure that VLAN information so it could tag it correctly before traffic gets sent out of its network interface card. So without further ado, let's go to the hands-on lab and we'll configure these static IP addresses on each of our ESXi hosts. So let's begin in the lab on ESXi 1. Now, if it's all grayed out like this, all you need to do is simply put your mouse there in that window and then press enter, and that brings back the nice, beautiful, bumblebee looking color scheme. And in order to log on to the DCUI to view and customize the settings, we're going to go ahead and press the F2 key. So let's do that now. So we'll press F2, and it's going to prompt us to log on. Now the default username is root in lowercase, so we'll use the down arrow key, and then we'll put in the password in the password field. And if you want to use the shortcut from the lab environment to go ahead and simply paste that password in, as we discussed in the previous nugget, please feel free to use that feature. And if you do, make sure we click back in this field so that the lab environment knows we're talking to this computer, so we can continue to press enter for OK to log on. So we'll press enter, give it a moment to initialize, and here is the DCUI that we can now work with. To navigate up and down, we simply use the up and down arrow keys to go through these options. To select an item, you go ahead and use the up and down arrows to go ahead and highlight it and then press enter to select it. So we could change the password if we wanted to right here. If we use the down arrow, we could configure the management network, which is what we want to do, because currently we're using a DHCP assigned address, we want a static address. So with the focus of configure management network right here, we'll simply go ahead and press enter to go ahead and change that information. So we'll press enter. And the first thing it highlights here is network adapters. Now currently we're working with the first network adapter, which is VMNIC 0. So the numbering starts 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the numbering starts with 0. And one of the cool things is if we wanted to see all the network adapters with the network adapters up here highlighted, all we need to do is simply press enter, and it conveniently gives us a list of all the network adapters. It's also showing us right here which one we're currently using for the management network connection. So there's our VMNIC 0 through 5. VMNIC 0 is currently being used for the management network. And here's all the MAC addresses. And I did a little extra work on the back end to hard code those MAC addresses to make it very easy to identify which network interface card was which, just based on the layer 2 MAC address. So the first adapter, I gave it a 01, then a 02, then a 03, etc. Another thing for convenience I did is I configured these 2 digits of the MAC address to match the actual ESXi host. For example, ESXi1 has 2 1s right there. ESXi2 has 2 2s right there. And ESXi3 has 2 3s in those 2 positions. And that's because those hosts, they're going to be on the same networks. We can't have 2 different devices using the same MAC address without some conflict. So that way I can keep the MAC addresses unique and also tell which devices they belong to just by looking at the MAC addresses. So those are just some conveniences that I built into this lab for you and I if we're ever looking at MAC addresses and wonder who they belong to. To see additional details for this highlighted VMNIC 0, we can just hit the D character for View Details, and it'll bring up more details regarding that adapter. So if we press D on the keyboard, This network interface card, which it's referring to as VMNIC0, has a hardware label of Ethernet 0. There's the MAC address. It's currently connected, and it's also connected to a logical switch in VMware, which is called vSwitch 0, which is the default switch that's installed by default when we install an ESXi host. So we'll go ahead and press Enter to go ahead and escape those details, and then we can hit the Escape key to go ahead and go back to the main menu for the DCUI. If we hit the down arrow, we have the VLAN options. This is where we could specify the 802.1q tag that we want to use if we're connected to a switch that's trunking with this host. And if we use the down arrow again, we can go to the IPv4 configuration. To change it, we simply press Enter. Now, the first couple of times you use this, it's a little bit tricky because what we're going to do is we're going to arrow up and down with the up and down arrow keys, and then we're going to hit the space bar to go ahead and select it. So for example, if we want to set a static address, we'd use the down arrow key twice to highlight this option. Let's do that right now. So we'll do the down arrow and down arrow again, and then with that highlighted, set static IP address and network configuration, we'll hit the space bar. And then once we've done that, we can then hit the down arrow key again, and we can put in the static IP address that we want to use. Now, conveniently, because we dynamically learned the correct address based on the DHCP server and its static DHCP reservations, we don't have to change the IP address here because that, in this case, is the one we want to use. So 192.168.1.101 for ESXi host 1, 102 for host 2, and 103 for host 3. We are using a 24-bit mask, and we're also using this as the default gateway. That was also provided initially via DHCP. Also, via DHCP, I handed out the correct DNS server, which is .100, so that the ESXi host can both do name resolution, and DNS is also configured so that all the host addresses are in DNS. For example, ESXi-1 is in there, ESXi-2 is in there, and ESXi-3 is in there in DNS at the DNS server of .100 for the lab environment. And if you want more specific training on how to implement things like DHCP and DNS in a Windows Server 2016 environment, please check out our course 70-741 for some additional hands-on lab with specific details on how those are configured if you want to get that training as well. So for this lab, I wanted to focus on ESXi and not Windows networking, but I also at the same time wanted to tell you where you can go specifically if you want to get that training as well. So with that set, we'll go ahead and press Enter to go ahead and accept it. Then we'll use the down arrow key, and we'll go to the IPv6 configuration, press Enter there. And if we want to disable IPv6, we'll simply, with the Disable IPv6 selected, we'll hit the spacebar once, and then we'll simply press Enter to disable the IPv6. Now, to implement those changes, even though we put in the configuration, to make them actually happen, we need to hit the Escape key to exit this menu. And then once we do hit Escape, it lets us know that we've made changes to the management network connection, and we'd have to press Y here to go ahead and apply those changes and reboot the host. And now we'll press Y to go ahead and apply the changes and restart the management network. So we'll press Y, and it's going to go ahead and do the reboot. Then we repeat that process for ESXi2 and ESXi3. The exact same steps, except for the IP address we're going to use on ESXi2 is going to be .102, and the IP address we're going to use on ESXi3 is going to be .103. And just for grins, let's go ahead and do ESXi2 together. So here we are at ESXi2. We'll press F2 to go ahead and log on. We'll hit the down arrow key. We'll supply the password, and then press Enter to log on. And then we'll use the down arrow key to configure the management network. We'll press Enter. We'll arrow down to IPv4, press Enter. We'll arrow down to Set Static IPv4 Address. Hit the space bar to select that and press Enter because the current information is correct. We'll press Enter, and then go down to IPv6 with the down arrow, press Enter. And with Disable IPv6 highlighted, we'll hit space to select that, and then press Enter, and then Escape, and then we'll press Y to apply those changes and reboot. And then once again, we do that same process on ESXi3. So have some fun in the hands-on lab in using the direct console user interface to manage and configure the IP address information, and I'll see you, my friend, in the very next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.